A boy was shot. A deacon stood over his body, whispering prayers. The town believed it was a tragic accident. But they were wrong. Beneath the hymns and holy words was a plan soaked in fear, hatred, and betrayal. Before you judge, you need to hear the whole story. Before the sirens, before the betrayal, there was a boy named Lucian Price in a town that believed it was too good, too righteous, too safe for something so unthinkable to ever happen within its walls. This is where our story truly begins. On a morning so perfect, no one could have imagined the horror waiting in the wings. The town of Willowridge awoke under a flawless sky. Sunlight bathed the cobblestone streets, and the towering spires of Silverpine Fellowship Church shimmered like beacons of hope against the azure sky. Birds sang from the eaves of the townhouses. The scent of fresh-baked bread from the local bakery floated through the streets, weaving among the townsfolk, beginning their day with smiles and soft conversations. Inside the church, preparations for the service unfolded with ritualistic precision. The choir, dressed in deep sapphire robes, rehearsed the hymns that would soon rise into the vaulted ceilings. The aroma of polished wood and old parchment mingled with the faint fragrance of fresh lilies arranged near the pulpit. Ushers straightened hymnals and polished offering plates. The organist tested a few chords, the notes swelling and retreating. Like ocean waves against the sanctuary walls, Lucian Price sat quietly in the second row, his suit meticulously ironed. Beside him, Naomi Price sat rigid, fingers laced so tightly around her Bible that her knuckles turned white. The Price family had occupied the same pew for as long as anyone could remember, a silent proclamation of their faith and constancy. They were fixtures of the congregation, trusted, respected, and above suspicion. Lucian shifted uneasily, glancing at his phone. An unsent message blinked back at him. Today might be the day I tell them. His thumb hovered over the send button. Before he tucked the device back into his pocket, within him, a battle raged louder than the swelling voices of the choir. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat that only he could hear. Every breath felt heavier, harder to draw, as if the very air was conspiring against him. The congregation filed in, exchanging pleasantries and sanctified smiles, oblivious to the silent implosion in Lucian's heart. Elderly couples shuffled to their usual seats. Families corralled fidgety children with gentle whispers and stern looks. Teenagers huddled in the back rows, giggling and nudging one another when they thought the adults were not looking. A scene of serene normalcy. A comforting rhythm that masked the growing storm. Deacon Silas Vane emerged from the vestry. His robe crisp and blindingly white, his eyes haunted. As he ascended the pulpit steps, he paused, one trembling hand resting on the polished wood, drawing strength from the structure that had come to define his existence. His face betrayed none of the turmoil hidden beneath his stoic exterior. To the gathered congregation, he appeared the very image of righteous devotion. The opening hymn, Blessed Assurance, began with delicate piano notes. The congregation rose, as one voices blending into a harmonious river of praise. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow shards across bowed heads and uplifted hands. The music swelled, lifting spirits heavenward. Lucian sang too, but his voice was a whisper. Sweat prickled at his hairline. Familiar faces smiled unknowingly. Would they still smile if they knew his truth? His legs trembled beneath him. The urge to flee surged within him, but he held his ground, anchored by a fragile thread of courage. Beside him, Naomi squeezed his trembling hand, thinking it was nerves. She had no idea of the magnitude of the choice her son wrestled with that morning. Her face lined with worry and love. It was a tether to a world Lucian feared he might lose forever. Near the altar, Deacon Vane stood motionless. His right hand drifted behind the pulpit, a gesture so subtle and practiced that no one noticed. His fingers brushed against something hidden just out of sight. The hymn reached its climax. The voices soared, filling the sanctuary with a triumphant sound. Then came a single sharp crack. For a heartbeat, the congregation froze. Confusion painted every face. The music faltered. Another crack followed, Lucian's body jolted. His eyes widened in shock. Blood bloomed across his crisp white shirt as he crumpled sideways into the pew. His body folded unnaturally, like a puppet whose strings had been severed. Naomi screamed, a raw, ragged sound. Around her, panic erupted. Hymnals fell. Chairs scraped. Children cried. Adults shouted conflicting instructions. Some congregants bolted for the exits, shoving past one another in a desperate scramble. Others dropped to their knees, clutching loved ones, praying in frantic whispers. The ancient sanctuary, once a bastion of peace, transformed into a maelstrom of chaos and terror. The smell of blood and fear tainted the air. Through it all, Deacon Vane descended the pulpit steps. His robe flared with each movement, his face carved into a mask of solemn tragedy. He knelt beside Lucian, placing a hand on the boy's head, muttering inaudible prayers, as if the act of touch could mend the violence he had wrought. Sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights strobed through the stained glass windows, turning saints and angels into grotesque phantoms, their faces distorted in the shifting light. Detective Cassian Holt arrived moments later. Years on the force had hardened him, but the sight still turned his stomach. Blood-stained pews, a mother keening over her son, a congregation paralyzed by grief and horror. He felt the weight of their stares, their silent pleas for answers he did not yet have. Holt knelt beside Lucian's body. 2 gunshot wounds to the back, clean and precise. This was no accident. He rose and addressed the trembling crowd. Did anyone see the shooter? Shaken heads, muted sobs, faces pale and stricken. Only Deacon Vane answered. I saw a shadow in the back doorway, he rasped. Holt narrowed his eyes. Something about Vane's composure set alarms ringing in his mind. Too calm, too rehearsed. Forensic teams swept the area. 2 spent 9mm shell casings were found. Strangely, faint traces of gunpowder residue were discovered near the pulpit, not at the rear of the church. A subtle but damning clue. The sun outside continued to shine, oblivious to the darkness that had fallen on Silverpine Fellowship Church, and within those ancient stone walls. An unthinkable mystery had just begun to unfold. The hours following, the shooting unfolded with agonizing slowness, each moment stretched thin by grief and confusion. Silverpine Fellowship Church, once a sanctuary of peace, stood marred by bloodstains and shattered faith. Outside, the town of Willowridge buzzed with a mix of horror and disbelief. News vans crowded the narrow streets, their satellite dishes reaching hungrily toward the sky. Reporters jostled for space, eager to broadcast the tragedy that had cracked. The town's perfect facade. Detective Cassian Holt stood in the center aisle of the church, his gaze sweeping the scene before him. Crime scene tape crisscrossed the pews. Forensic technicians moved with solemn precision, photographing blood spatter, collecting shell casings, and dusting for fingerprints. The scent of gunpowder lingered, mixing with the metallic temps of blood and the fading perfume of lilies that still adorned the altar. Holt's mind churned. He knew instinctively that this was no random act of violence. Murders committed within houses of worship were rare, but when they happened, they tore communities apart in ways no other crime could. The betrayal of sacred trust left scars deeper than any knife. He moved methodically among the congregants who remained most too stunned to leave. Many stared into space, clutching their loved ones, their faces pale and hollow. Holt approached them gently, his voice low, his questions simple. Most had seen nothing. Many had their eyes closed in prayer at the critical moment. Yet Holt noticed an undercurrent beneath their terror, a strange tightness around the mouths. Flickering glances exchanged like secret handshakes. There was something unspoken here. Something the congregation was not ready to admit. When he approached Mrs. Juniper Wells, she was sitting slumped in a corner, her Sunday hat clutched against her chest like a lifeline. Holt knelt before her, softening his features. Mrs. Wells, he said gently, you mentioned earlier that Lucian had secrets. Can you tell me what you meant? She darted a look around the church, her hands trembling.
I hear,
she whispered hoarsely. Too many ears. Holt helped her to her feet and guided her outside. The sunlight was blinding after the dim interior of the church. They stood on the cracked stone steps, the town bustling in chaotic energy below them. Mrs. Wells clutched her hat tighter. "He was different," she said, voice quivering. "Not just dressing different. Talking different. Talking about finding his real self. Said God made a mistake." Holt absorbed her words carefully. He nodded once, gravely. "You understand, detective?" she continued, voice dropping to a whisper. "This town, it does not forgive what it does not understand." Holt thanked her and watched her shuffle away, her back bent, not just from age, but from the heavy burden of truth she had carried. At Red Valley Community College, Holt wandered through buzzing hallways. Students with backpacks and coffee cups milled about, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the tragedy consuming Willow Ridge. Flyers for various clubs covered the bulletin boards. One caught Holt's eye, a support group for LGBTQ youth. He tucked the observation away, in a modest office crowded with paperwork. Dean Orla Whitaker welcomed Holt. She was a middle-aged woman with keen eyes and an exhausted air. "Lucian Price was one of our finest students," she said without hesitation. "Brilliant, compassionate. But he carried burdens few could see." She pulled a file from her desk drawer and slid it across to Holt. "Standard academic records, until 3 months ago." A single sheet of paper caught Holt's attention. A formal request for a name and gender marker, changed from Lucinda Price to Lucian Price. "He asked us not to tell his family," Whitaker said, her voice thick with emotion. "Said it would destroy." Then, before Holt could ask more, a timid knock sounded at the door. A young man with disheveled hair and red-rimmed eyes entered hesitantly. "Dean Whitaker? You wanted to see me? Come in, Mika," she said. "Detective Holt has a few questions." Mika Sloan, Lucian's roommate, slumped into the chair opposite Holt. He twisted his hands in his lap, his face drawn tight with grief. "We're close," Mika said. Lucian was figuring things out. It wasn't easy, especially not here. "Did he mention any threats?" Holt asked. Micah nodded slowly. He started getting notes. Slipped under our door. Folded into his textbooks. Anonymous. Always quoting scripture. Twisted up to sound like warnings. He pulled out his phone and showed Holt grainy photographs. Torn pieces of paper with verses scrawled in jagged handwriting. The wages of sin is death, and repent or perish. Holt's gut twisted. He had seen this pattern before. Anonymous threats often escalated into violence when ignored. Did Lucian report any of this? "No," Micah said, voice breaking. He was too scared. He said if the wrong person found out, they would make sure he disappeared. Leaving the college, Holt returned to the church. He reviewed the security footage, most of it grainy and useless. One camera, however, captured something. Figuring. A white robe slips through a side door just moments after the shooting. "Could be any clergy member," a technician remarked with a shrug, but Holt felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Timing was too perfect. The movement too calculated. The forensic report confirmed his growing suspicion. The highest concentration of gunpowder residue was not near the rear exit where the shooter allegedly fled. It was around the pulpit, the place where Deacon Vane had stood. Further analysis of Vane's ceremonial robe revealed microscopic gunshot residue embedded. Within the right sleeve, not enough for an arrest yet, but the noose was tightening. Later that evening, Holt ventured behind the church where the grounds grew wild and untamed. There he found Abel Moore, known around town as Prophet Abel, a homeless man whose ramblings often blurred the line between madness and insight. "Saw the whole thing," Abel rasped, eyes bright with memory. "After the bang, I saw a white robe slip out the side, then sneak back in like nothing happened." "You are certain?" Holt pressed. "Ain't blind yet," Abel muttered with a grim smile. Holt scribbled down every detail. A clearer picture began to emerge. Premeditation, deceit, murder in the very house of God. As Holt drove home that night, the weight of the case pressed down on him like a stone. Lucian Price's face haunted him, not just as another victim, but as a symbol of innocence lost. He promised himself that he would uncover every lie, peel back every layer of deception. no matter how high or sacred the wall protecting the guilty might be. In Willow Ridge, trust was bleeding out like a wound no prayer could heal. And the darkness that had been hiding beneath the stained glass had only just begun to reveal itself. Detective Cassian Holt sat alone in his dimly lit office at the Willow Ridge Police Department. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights provided a constant, droning backdrop to his thoughts. The evidence board in front of him was a chaotic tapestry of photos, notes, and timelines, all connected by red strings that wove a narrative of betrayal and death. At the center of it all was Lucian Price. His smiling face stared back at Holt, a painful reminder of why he could not let this case slip into the cold archives. Around Lucian's photo, Holt had pinned images of the Silver Pine Fellowship Church, the side door where the white-robed figure had slipped away, the grainy screenshots from the security footage, and microscopic images of the gunpowder residue. Found on Deacon Vane's robe, the deeper Holt dug, the murkier the waters became. He had been in this town long enough to know its surface politeness masked deeper currents of judgment and fear. Willow Ridge had built its reputation on righteousness, but beneath its whitewashed walls, darkness festered. Holt pored over Deacon Silas's Vane's background. Publicly, Vane had been a pillar of the community. He led prayer groups, volunteered at the food bank, officiated weddings, and preached about love and salvation. Yet whispers from former congregants told a different story. About a year prior, something had shifted. His sermons had grown darker, more apocalyptic. He spoke often of purging the wicked and defending the sanctity of the flock. Holt tracked down Samuel Reed, a former youth leader at Silver Pine who had left the church. Abruptly 6 months ago, they met at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Vane changed after he went on that retreat, Samuel said, stirring his coffee nervously. He came back preaching that there were wolves among us, that some people wore masks of innocence, but were corrupting the town from within. Did he ever mention Lucian by name? Holt asked. Samuel hesitated, then nodded slowly. He warned parents to watch their children, said some influences were so evil they needed to be removed. I remember one night, after youth group, he told me Lucian was lost and would bring judgment down on us all. The knot in Holt's stomach tightened. He thanked Samuel and left the diner, his mind racing. Back at the precinct, Holt filed a request for a forensic sweep of Vane's home. The judge approved it within hours, largely thanks to the mounting evidence and Holt's relentless pressure. The search of Vane's modest house revealed more than Holt had dared hope for. Hidden in a locked trunk beneath Vane's bed were handwritten journals filled with increasingly erratic entries. They spoke of divine missions, cleansing the church, and saving souls through fire and sacrifice. One entry chilled Holt to the bone. I prayed for a sign, and the Lord answered, "The child must not be allowed to spread the sickness. Better to end one life than to let it fester and poison the many." Alongside the journals, they found a dismantled handgun cleaning kit, gun oil, and an empty Glock case. Forensic analysis would later confirm. It matched the make and model of the weapon found in the creek. The case was building itself. Layer by damning layer, Holt knew he needed more. Something irrefutable, something that would shatter any defense. Vane might try to mount. He turned to Naomi Price, Lucian's grieving mother. They met in the small, cluttered living room of Naomi's home. Photographs of Lucian lined every available surface, a heartbreaking tribute to a life cut short. "I need you to be strong, Naomi," Holt said gently. "I need you to tell me everything about the last conversation you had with Lucian." Naomi clutched a framed photo of Lucian to her chest. "He came to us 3 nights before he died," she whispered. "He told us about his transition, about how he had always known, deep down, that he was Lucian, not Lucinda." Her voice cracked. "I was shocked, but I loved him. I told him we would figure it out, but Silas... Silas flew into a rage, called Lucian an abomination, said the devil had claimed our boy. He threw his Bible across the room and screamed that God would strike us down if we did not act." Tears streamed down her face. "I should have protected him better," she sobbed. "I should have known." Holt stayed with her long after the interview ended, offering silent support. Inside, he burned with a fury that threatened to consume him. Vane had cloaked his hatred in faith and had murdered his own son in the name of a twisted righteousness. The final piece fell into place when forensics completed their analysis of the recovered Glock, microscopic remnants of the original serial number allowed them to trace it back to a gun shop where Silas Vane had purchased it under a false name several years earlier. Ballistics matched it to the bullets pulled from Lucian's body. It was time to bring Vane in. That Sunday evening, Holt and 2 uniformed officers arrived at Silver Pine Fellowship Church. The evening service was underway. Vane stood at the pulpit, thundering about judgment and repentance. His voice echoed off the stained glass windows. Filled with a fervor that now sounded more chilling than inspiring, Holt waited until the final hymn ended. As the last notes faded, he stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the flickering sanctuary lights. Silas Vane Holt announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lucian Price." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Lucian Price, seated in the back, clutched her hands to her mouth as silent sobs shook her body. Vane's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He lowered his head and stepped away from the pulpit, allowing the officers to cuff him without resistance. The congregation watched in stunned silence as their deacon, their spiritual leader, was led away in handcuffs. Outside, the reporters pounced, their cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Holt shielded Naomi and guided her to a waiting car, offering what little protection he could. In the interrogation room, Vane remained stone-faced. His court-appointed lawyer sat beside him, silent. "Shh. You can still help yourself," Holt said, leaning across the table. "Tell the truth." Vane looked up slowly. His eyes burned with a strange intensity. "I saved him," he said, his voice steady. "I saved him from eternal damnation." Holt felt a cold chill run down his spine. There would be no remorse here, no redemption. As the sun set over Willow Ridge, casting long shadows across the town's tidy streets, Holt filed the final report. The evidence was overwhelming. The trial would come, and the town would have to face the darkness festering within its heart. But for now, justice, however imperfect, had been set in motion. Lucian Price would not be forgotten, and Holt would make sure of it. The trial of Deacon Silas Vane became the event that would define Willow Ridge for generations. It was not simply a legal proceeding, but a confrontation with the town's very soul. Every day, people crowded the courthouse steps, holding up signs either condemning or defending Vane. Television cameras arrived from neighboring cities, hungry for footage of small-town America grappling with its darkest secrets. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Judge Rebecca Harlow presided with a stern hand, determined to keep the proceedings from descending into chaos. Prosecutor Margot Lacey had prepared meticulously, knowing that she was not just prosecuting a murderer, but dismantling an illusion of righteousness that had protected Vane for far too long. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They showed the jury the security footage of the white-robed figure slipping out of the side door, the forensic analysis linking the recovered Glock to Vane, and the journal entries describing his divine mission to cleanse the church. Witnesses testified about Vane's increasingly extreme sermons, his warnings about wolves in the flock, and his fixation on rooting out corruption. Naomi Price's testimony was devastating. Her voice shook as she recounted Lucian's bravery and Silas Vane's violent outbursts. She described nights of fear, her failed attempts to reason with Silas, and her guilt for not protecting her son more fiercely. Micah Sloan testified about the scripture-laden threats Lucian had received. Tearfully, he revealed that Lucian had confided fears that someone in the church, someone close, wanted him dead. Micah's guilt weighed heavily on him, admitting he had urged Lucian to keep silent for fear of community backlash. Dean Orla Whitaker provided further damning testimony, confirming Lucian's request to change his name and gender marker and the college's efforts to protect his privacy against the wishes of an intolerant town. The journals were the prosecution's crown jewel. Vane's own words laid bare his belief that Lucian's existence endangered not just his soul, but the very fabric of Willow Ridge. In Vane's mind, God had issued a divine command, and failure to act would bring ruin upon them all. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Lacey exposed the deep contradictions in Vane's worldview. He preached love and salvation but practiced fear and death. She painted a picture of a man so desperate to maintain control. He would rather destroy his own flesh and blood than admit the world was changing beyond his grasp. When Silas Vane took the stand, he spoke with chilling calmness.
Ow!
He detailed a dream of angels and warnings. He insisted he acted not in hatred but in obedience. He showed no remorse. The courtroom held its breath when Prosecutor Lacey asked her final question. If given the chance, she asked, would you do it again? Without hesitation, Vane replied, yes. Chaos erupted. Cries of anguish and shouts of outrage filled the courtroom. Judge Harlow pounded her gavel until silence reluctantly returned. The jury deliberated for 2 tense days. During that time, Willowridge descended into near anarchy. Protesters clashed in the streets. The Silverpine Fellowship Church was vandalized, its windows shattered and walls spray-painted with messages of both love and hate. Naomi Price received death threats. Micah Sloane's car was vandalized. Detective Holt personally escorted Naomi. And Micah, under police protection, new evidence surfaced, hinting at an even darker web. Investigators uncovered coded letters Vane had sent from jail to a secret group calling themselves the Redeemers of Purity. The letters urged them to continue his mission, warning that Willowridge was just the beginning. The Redeemers had planned further acts of violence, targeting LGBTQ centers and advocates across the state. Authorities acted swiftly, arresting several members and averting additional tragedies. Holt realized that had Lucian lived, he would have become an even greater target for these zealots. In death, Lucian's story had exposed a network of hate that might otherwise have remained hidden in the shadows. When the jury returned, their verdict was clear. Guilty, the foreman said, voice unwavering. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Relief and sorrow collided inside the courtroom. Naomi Price wept openly. Micah Sloane hugged Dean Whitaker. Even members of the gallery, who had once silently supported Vane, lowered their heads in shame. Judge Harlow sentenced Silas Vane to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her voice was steely as she delivered the sentence. You failed. Your son, she said. You failed your community. You failed the faith you claimed to defend. Even as Vane was led away in shackles, his expression remained serene, convinced of his righteousness to the very end. The fallout from the trial was seismic. Willowridge fractured further. Some clung to Vane's teachings in secret gatherings, refusing to accept the jury's verdict. Others sought repentance, determined to rebuild the town on foundations of acceptance and love. Naomi Price became a tireless advocate, founding Lucian's Promise. The nonprofit began modestly, hosting small support groups and counseling sessions. But soon, word spread. Families from neighboring towns joined. Survivors of religious rejection found solace within its walls. National news outlets picked up the story, and donations flooded in. Detective Holt, who had carried the weight of Lucian's death heavily, found a renewed purpose. He became an advocate against hate crimes, using Lucian's story to educate law enforcement, churches, and communities about the deadly consequences of intolerance. Willowridge itself slowly began to heal. A new Silverpine Community Center was erected on the ashes of the old church. The building was filled with light and space for all faiths, all identities, all walks of life. A memorial to Lucian Price stood proudly at its entrance. A bronze statue of a young man standing tall, a quiet smile on his face. Beneath it, the inscription read, "In memory of those who lived their truth and paid the price. May their courage guide us." Lucien's legacy endured. In every whispered confession made without fear, in every hand held in solidarity, in every tear shed for those who dared to live authentically, Lucien had lived bravely. He had died because of fear, but he had sparked a movement that could not be stopped. He had become truly unstoppable. In the aftermath of the trial, Willowridge entered a period of uneasy silence. The town that once prided itself on its unity now found itself grappling with the broken pieces of its identity. Familiar smiles were replaced by furtive glances. Sunday services were sparsely attended. Shops that once welcomed everyone with open doors now displayed subtle signs of division. Naomi Price spent her nights in Lucian's old room, surrounded by remnants of a life full of promise. His books remained on the shelves, notebooks filled with dreams and sketches of a future he would never see. Each night, Naomi lit a candle beneath his photograph, silent vigil that burned with a mother's endless love and guilt. Lucian's promise, the nonprofit Naomi founded, quickly grew beyond her modest expectations. Initially housed in a single rented room above a bakery, the organization expanded to a sprawling community center through donations and volunteer efforts. It offered counseling, support groups, educational workshops, and a safe haven for LGBTQ youth who faced rejection and violence. National attention turned to Willow Ridge. News stations profiled Naomi's work. Documentaries were filmed. Celebrities lent their voices to Lucian's cause. What began as a grassroots effort became a symbol of resilience and hope in the face of hatred. Detective Cassian Holt remained by Naomi's side. Haunted by the case and the senseless loss of a young life, he dedicated himself to ensuring Lucian's memory would not fade. Holt traveled to neighboring towns, sharing Lucian's story at schools, churches, and police academies. His talks were raw and honest, challenging communities to confront their own prejudices. Micah Sloan also found a new purpose through Lucian's promise. Consumed by guilt over not doing more to protect Lucian, he became a tireless advocate, speaking out about the dangers of silence and fear. His voice, once timid, grew strong, fueled by the memory of his friend. Meanwhile, Silas Vane languished. In prison, his influence waned as the Redeemers of Purity disbanded under the weight of public scrutiny and legal action. Yet even in captivity, Vane remained unrepentant, convinced he had acted in divine service. He became a cautionary tale within Willow Ridge, a reminder of what hatred disguised as faith could destroy. The town itself slowly stitched its wounds. The Silverpine Community Center thrived as a beacon of acceptance. Interfaith services were held. Diversity festivals celebrated identities once hidden in fear. Slowly, a new generation grew up in Willow Ridge, taught to value empathy over judgment. 1 year after the trial, a memorial service was held in Lucian's honor. Hundreds gathered at the community center. Naomi, standing at the podium, held back tears as she spoke. Lucian was light, she said, voice trembling but unwavering. A light that fear tried to snuff out. But light, true light, cannot be destroyed. It spreads. It ignites other flames. And together, we become stronger. As candles were lit one by one, the courtyard outside the center transformed into a sea of flickering stars. Each flame a promise. Each glow a testament. Among the crowd, Holt watched with a heavy but hopeful heart. He saw old faces and new, all gathered not to mourn, but to celebrate. Lucian's spirit lived on in every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, every voice raised in truth. Later that evening, standing before Lucian's statue, Holt whispered a vow into the night air. We will not forget, we will not fail you. Again. Across the country, other communities began their own transformations. Inspired by the movement that started in a tiny, fractured town called Willow Ridge, schools introduced anti-bullying programs. Churches revisited their teachings on acceptance. Town councils passed ordinances protecting LGBTQ rights. Lucian's name became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of triumph. His life, though short, created ripples that reached far beyond the boundaries of Willow Ridge. His courage challenged the fearful. His authenticity inspired the hidden. His story changed the course of countless lives. And so, long after the headlines faded, long after the protest, signs were put away. Lucian Price remained a force in the world, in every whisper of hope, in every act of courage, in every heart that chose love over hate. Lucian Price had lived bravely. He had died because of fear. But his truth echoed louder than any bullet ever could. He had become truly unstoppable.